The snowstorm raged through Raven Creek that night, swallowing the streets in icy silence. Beneath the old rusted bridge, a 9-year-old girl sat alone, barefoot, shivering, her torn pink dress frozen stiff against her tiny body. Cars passed above. People walked by. Some didn't see her. Some chose not to. Her lips were blue, her breath shallow, her small hands clutching her stomach as if trying to hold on to life itself. And as the wind howled louder, her voice cracked into the storm's emptiness. "Please, someone, help me!" But no one came, and with every passing second, she was slipping away. If your heart is still beating, comment Amen and stand with us, because no child should ever be left to freeze, alone. Michael Rourke, 49 years old, trudged along the frozen path with his German Shepherd Shadow close at his side. Michael's shoulders were broad but hunched, his frame strong yet weary beneath a faded green jacket zipped up to his neck. His salt and pepper hair was cropped short, and his square jaw was shadowed with 3 days of stubble. He had the weathered look of someone who had spent too long under a foreign sun, and his deep-set hazel eyes carried something heavier than age, memories etched into silence, regrets carved into bone. Michael had served 2 tours in Iraq nearly 2 decades ago, but the war had never left him. It clung to him in ways he rarely spoke of. In the quiet nights when sleep refused to come, in the unshakable sense that danger always waited in the shadows, and in the faint tremor of his hands when the wind howled just a little too much like artillery fire. Shadow, his 6-year-old German Shepherd, padded silently through the snow, his thick black and tan coat glistening under the dim streetlights. At 28 inches tall and nearly 80 pounds, Shadow carried himself with a quiet confidence born from years of training. Once a military working dog, he had served beside Michael before being retired from active duty, after an injury to his right hind leg left a faint scar hidden beneath his fur. Despite that, he was powerful, alert, and unnervingly intelligent, the kind of dog who could sense danger long before it came. To Michael, Shadow wasn't just a companion. He was the last piece of a life that had nearly fallen apart. Michael walked this route most nights. Raven Creek was small, the kind of place where everyone waved, but no one asked too many questions. And though he lived on the outskirts in a modest 1-story house, these late-night walks had become his ritual. They calmed the static in his head, the voices and echoes that sometimes rose when the world went quiet. Tonight, though, something felt different. The cold bit deeper, the silence hung heavier, and Shadow's ears were pinned forward, his breath steaming in small clouds as he sniffed the wind. Michael noticed. Shadow was tuned to him, and he to Shadow, a rhythm built from years of trust. The German Shepherd's sudden tension was never nothing. "What is it, boy?" Michael murmured, his voice low, rough from disuse. Shadow's response was a deep, guttural sound, more growl than bark, and his nose dipped toward the embankment near the bridge. Michael slowed, scanning the shadows beneath the concrete structure. The Madison Bridge loomed above them like an ancient spine of steel and rust, its underside coated with icicles that caught the flicker of the street lamps above. Then Shadow lunged forward, pulling on the leash, his muscles taut as a drawn bow. Michael followed, boots crunching hard against frozen gravel, his breath forming small bursts in the frigid air. At first, he thought it might be an animal, a stray raccoon, maybe a deer caught in the brush. But then the sound came, soft, broken, almost too faint to hear. A sob. Michael froze. Years in combat had trained his senses to split seconds into eternities. He crouched instinctively, one hand on Shadow's harness, the other steadying himself on the cold railing. His gaze swept the shadows beneath the bridge until he saw it. Movement, small and uneven, huddled between 2 concrete supports. He stepped closer, heart pounding against his ribs. The dim glow of the flashlight in his hand cut through the dark, revealing what Shadow had already sensed. A little girl. She couldn't have been more than 9 years old. She sat curled up against the stone, her knees tucked tightly into her chest, her arms locked around her shins, as though she could make herself disappear. Her pink dress, or what had once been pink, was torn at the hem, smudged with dirt and ice, the fabric clinging to her thin frame as though it had frozen there. Her bare feet were scratched and bleeding, skin pale as marble against the black earth, and her tangled brown curls stuck to her tear-streaked cheeks. For a long moment, she didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even seem to breathe. The flashlight's beams settled on her face, and in its pale circle, Michael saw the emptiness of someone who had already been left behind too many times. "Hey there," he said softly, lowering himself to one knee and pulling Shadow back slightly so he wouldn't frighten her. His voice, though rough, carried a gentleness he didn't often use anymore. "It's okay. You're safe." The girl flinched, just barely, and her small hands clutched tighter around her legs. Shadow, sensing her fear, lowered himself slowly, resting his chest against the snow, ears pinned back, his amber eyes steady and calm. He didn't bark. He didn't move. He just waited. Michael extended his hand, gloved fingers hovering a respectful distance. "My name's Michael," he said quietly, "and this here's Shadow. We're not gonna hurt you." For several seconds there was only silence. Then, finally, she turned her face slightly, just enough for him to see the deep brown of her wide, glassy eyes. When she spoke, her voice was so faint he almost didn't hear it. They threw me away." Michael's breath caught. He leaned closer, his tone steady, though his chest burned at her words. "Who threw you away, sweetheart?" She swallowed hard, her chin trembling. "Mom, Dad, they said they don't want me anymore." Shadow whimpered softly, his ears flicking forward as if he understood. Michael's jaw tightened beneath his stubble. He had seen death. He had seen the aftermath of war. But nothing, prepared him for the quiet devastation of a child left in the snow. He noticed then, as his flashlight dipped lower, the faint red rings around her wrists, shallow but undeniable, perfect circles that looked too uniform to be accidental. Not rope burns, not random scratches. Something colder. Zip ties, maybe. And beneath the layers of cold air, a sharp chemical scent clung faintly to her clothes. Antiseptic, clinical, out of place in the damp and dirt beneath the bridge. Michael's mind raced, but he kept his voice gentle. "What's your name?" Her gaze fell to the mud, her lips parting just enough to whisper, "Lily." "Okay, Lily," he said softly, testing the name on his tongue like something fragile. "I've got you now." He shrugged off his jacket, the heavy military green fabric stiff with frost, and draped it carefully over her shoulders. It swallowed her small frame, but she didn't resist. For the first time, her tiny hand reached out, fingers tangling into Shadow's thick fur, holding on like he was the only solid thing left in her world. The German shepherd shifted slightly, pressing his side gently against her legs, a steady warmth against the cold stone. Michael knew that instinct in Shadow, the quiet, immovable presence of protection. Snow continued to drift, settling against Michael's lashes and melting into cold tracks down his cheek. He glanced up toward the bridge above them, where headlights glimmered faintly in the storm. Cars passed, people crossed, and yet no one had seen. Or maybe no one had wanted to. He clenched his jaw, pulling his radio from his belt, his voice low and deliberate. "Dispatch, this is Rourke," he said, forcing calm into his words. "I've got a child here, approximate age 9. Injuries visible, no shoes. I need an ambulance and child protective services to Madison Bridge immediately." The static hissed in his earpiece before a voice crackled back confirmation. Michael lowered the radio, turning his attention back to Lily. She didn't speak again, but her grip on Shadow tightened, and in the silent language between man and dog, Michael understood. This was just the surface of something deeper, darker. And though he didn't know it yet, tonight beneath the frozen bridge, his life, and hers, would never be the same. The storm had slowed to a soft, icy drizzle over Raven Creek, leaving the small town blanketed in white silence. Inside Michael Rourke's modest house on the edge of town, the air was warmer, but a lingering heaviness clung to the walls, as if the night itself had followed them home. A single lamp in the corner spilled a muted yellow glow across the living room, cutting soft shadows along the edges of the worn furniture. Shadow lay stretched on the rug near the coffee table, his black and tan fur still damp from melted snow. His strong frame was curled into a protective half circle, ears slightly twitching, amber eyes fixed on the couch where Lily sat, small and still beneath a thick gray blanket. The girl hadn't moved much since they returned. Her knees were tucked tight to her chest beneath the blanket, her tiny shoulders rounded inward, her head bowed so low her tangled curls fell across her face. Her bare feet, now wrapped in socks Michael had warmed near the heater, pressed deep into the cushions as though she were trying to vanish inside them. Michael sat across from her in a low, worn armchair, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped loosely together. His deep-set hazel eyes studied her quietly, though every muscle in his body carried a subtle tension, the same coiled awareness that had never truly left him after Iraq. The heater hummed softly, filling the silence between them. The warmth in the room battled with the weight pressing against Michael's chest. The unspoken questions, the possibilities circling like distant wolves. He kept his voice low, steady, careful. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "No one's going to hurt you, Lily." For a moment, there was no response. Then, slowly, Lily shifted beneath the blanket, her small hand reaching hesitantly toward the rug where Shadow lay. The German shepherd lifted his head and lowered it gently against her knees, his weight a quiet promise. Lily's thin fingers sank into his thick fur. She clung there, almost like she was holding on to the last solid thing she trusted. Michael leaned forward slightly, his voice softer than before. "Lily, can you tell me what happened? Only what you want to." She didn't meet his eyes. Her voice, when it finally came, was fragile and uneven, as if the words themselves hurt to speak. "They put me in the dark." Michael's jaw tensed beneath his stubble. "Who did?" Lily hesitated, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders before whispering, "Mom and Dad, but not real Mom and Dad." She trembled as the words left her, and Michael felt his chest tighten. He stayed still, giving her space, letting her set the pace. "They locked me down there," she continued, her voice no louder than a breath. "In the cold room. No windows, no light. They said I talk too much, that I eat too much." Michael swallowed hard, steadying his breathing. He glanced at her wrists, and under the dim lamplight, the faint red marks became more visible. Thin, perfect rings circling her skin, too uniform to be random bruises. "Lily," he said softly, "did they tie your hands?" Her chin dipped once, a tiny, tight nod. Michael sat back slightly, fingers curling loosely in his lap as he forced himself to stay calm. Shadow's ears twitched at the tension in the room, and the German shepherd shifted closer, pressing his sturdy frame against Lily's legs. For the first time, her voice carried the smallest hint of urgency, as if needing him to understand. "They said I should live with the rats." Michael's chest burned with a quiet fury, but he pushed it down. Rage wouldn't help her now. He drew a slow breath, grounding himself, then asked carefully, "Do you remember anything else? Anything about the place?" Lily's dark eyes flickered, distant, trapped somewhere behind memory. "It smelled funny," she whispered, like the doctors, when they make your skin sting." Michael froze, the pieces falling together in a way that made the room tilt slightly beneath him. Industrial disinfectant, the faint chemical scent he had noticed on her clothes at the bridge. Now it made sense. Lily hugged the blanket closer, resting her chin on her knees, her voice dropping even lower. "Sometimes I hear a car, a big one, black, loud. It came late, and when it stopped, the basement door opened." Michael's gaze sharpened. A black SUV. He filed it away, his instincts stirring with the familiar alertness of a soldier reading a battlefield. This wasn't random. "Did you ever see who drove it?" he asked carefully. Lily shook her head quickly. "They didn't let me out. I don't know where the house is. I never saw outside." Her small voice cracked, and she rubbed her wrist absently, almost like she could erase the marks if she tried hard enough. Michael sat back slowly, running a hand across his jaw, his breath heavy but measured. The rhythm of his heart had shifted. This wasn't just a cruel family. Something darker hid beneath the surface, something deliberate. He leaned forward again, softening his voice. "You're safe here now. No one's taking you back there." Lily didn't answer, but her tiny hand clenched tighter around Shadow's fur. The German shepherd exhaled through his nose and stayed still, a quiet sentinel between them. Michael leaned against the armrest, eyes fixed on the pale frost collecting along the edges of the window. Somewhere beyond this quiet street, answers waited. He didn't know where yet, but one thing had become painfully clear. This wasn't just neglect. This was something built, and he intended to tear it apart. The morning light in Raven Creek broke pale and cold, the winter sun struggling to pierce the thick veil of frost clinging to rooftops and branches. Michael Rourke hadn't slept. The night had been a tangle of restless pacing, Shadow's quiet vigilance, and the steady rhythm of Lily's fragile breathing in the guest room. Every time Michael closed his eyes, he saw her tiny frame curled beneath the blanket, saw the faint rings on her wrists, and heard her voice whispering about the dark basement and the black SUV. By mid-morning, he knew he couldn't wait. Something inside him, part instinct, part muscle memory, wouldn't allow it. There were too many unanswered questions, too many fragments of danger stitched into Lily's story. He stood in the kitchen, fastening the zipper of his faded green field jacket, while Shadow sat at his feet, tail curled neatly around his legs, watching Michael with those amber eyes that seemed to know more than he said. "You're coming," Michael muttered, grabbing his keys. Minutes later, the old Ford pickup rumbled down the icy streets, its heater struggling against the chill. Shadow sat upright in the passenger seat, his gaze fixed outside, ears twitching every time a car passed. When Michael glanced at him, he thought of all the nights they'd spent like this in Iraq, sitting side by side in armored transports, both of them trusting the other to sense danger first. The Raven Creek Police Department sat on the corner of Maple and Fifth, a squat brick building dusted white by snowdrifts, the flag out front snapping faintly in the cold wind. Inside, the scent of old coffee and disinfectant clung to the air, mingling with the low hum of ringing phones and muffled voices. Behind the front desk, an older officer nodded at Michael before motioning toward a glass-walled office at the end of the hall. "She's waiting," he said simply. Sarah Miller stood when Michael approached, extending a hand that was warm despite the cold outside. She was in her early 40s, tall and lean, with sharp shoulders under a charcoal blazer. Her auburn hair was pulled into a neat bun at the nape of her neck, and her pale skin carried faint freckles that softened the intensity of her hazel eyes. Those eyes, though steady, had seen too much. Years of dealing with neglect cases, domestic abuse, and broken families had carved thin lines around them, but her composure was unshaken. "Michael Rourke," she said with a quiet nod, her voice even and smooth. "Detective Sarah Miller." Michael's handshake was firm, his expression guarded. "Appreciate you taking the time." "I got your message about the girl," Sarah said, gesturing for him to sit. "Why don't you tell me everything from the start?" Michael recounted the events of the previous night, the storm, the bridge, the shivering child in the torn pink dress, and Lily's halting words about the basement, the restraints, and the SUV. As he spoke, Sarah listened without interruption, pen hovering above a leather-bound notebook, but rarely moving. When he finished, she exhaled slowly, leaning back in her chair. "Michael," she began, choosing her words carefully, "I've seen cases like this before, but I need to be honest with you. It may not be what you think it is." "You think I'm overreacting?" he asked, his tone level but his jaw tight. "I think," she said gently, "that right now, the most important thing is Lily's safety. You're not law enforcement anymore. I can't ask you to investigate this on your own. If this is what it sounds like, we're not just talking about abuse. We could be talking about something organized, and that's dangerous." Michael leaned forward, forearms resting on his knees. "I can't just sit at home while whoever did this keeps doing it to someone else." Her hazel eyes softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. "Then let me do my job, and you focus on keeping her safe. If this escalates, I'll keep you informed. But for now, stay out of the deeper waters." Michael nodded, though the tension in his shoulders didn't ease. Years of military instinct made it impossible for him to disengage when danger was near. Shadow, lying at Michael's feet, lifted his head as though sensing the current between them. His ears flicked toward the sound of distant footsteps outside the office, then back to Michael. Amber eyes locked like a silent reminder. We don't stand down when there's more to find. Sarah glanced down at the dog, a faint smile ghosting her lips. "He's beautiful. Military trained?" "Yeah," Michael said quietly, his gaze following Shadow's line of sight. "Best partner I ever had." For a brief moment, the heaviness eased, replaced by something softer, an understanding forged between two people used to seeing the pieces others missed. When the meeting ended, Sarah promised she'd start a file and forward Lily's details to Child Protective Services. She advised Michael to keep Lily indoors for now and report anything unusual immediately. Back in the truck, Michael sat for a moment before starting the engine, his breath fogging the windshield. Shadow shifted beside him, nose pressing lightly against his forearm, grounding him. "Yeah, I know," Michael muttered, glancing at the dog. "We're not done." Back home, Lily sat cross-legged on the couch, wrapped in the same blanket, small and silent. Her gaze tracked Shadow as he padded in and jumped onto the rug in front of her, lowering himself into a patient sprawl. Michael hung his jacket, then spotted Lily's small, battered backpack leaning against the wall. The faded pink fabric was worn thin at the seams, one strap hanging by a loose thread. Carefully, he set it on the coffee table and unzipped it, glancing toward Lily for permission. She hesitated, then nodded faintly. Inside were a half-crushed granola bar, a chipped hairbrush, and a folded piece of paper, soft from being handled too often. Michael opened it carefully. It was a drawing, crude lines drawn in bright green crayon, two stick figures holding hands beneath a crooked sun. Between them, a dog with pointed ears, and in uneven letters along the bottom, scrawled as though carved rather than written, "Me and real mom." Michael stared at the drawing for a long moment, his thumb brushing lightly over the paper. Shadow shifted, ears twitching as though sensing the weight of the discovery. Michael folded the paper carefully and slid it back into the bag, then sat down on the edge of the couch, resting his elbows on his knees. There was more to Lily's story than she could say, and now he was sure of it. Outside, the snow kept falling over Raven Creek, soft and soundless, muffling the world. Inside, Michael's resolve settled like stone. Something darker was moving beneath the surface of this town, and he intended to find it. The snow in Raven Creek had stopped falling, but the icy wind still gnawed at the streets, carrying whispers of unease through the quiet suburbs. It was late afternoon when Michael Rourke parked his old Ford along the curb of Elmwood, an affluent neighborhood tucked on the town's western edge. The houses here looked like they'd been plucked from glossy real estate brochures. Fresh coats of paint, neat white fences, manicured gardens, and identical porches lined with flower pots despite the frost. Beside him, Shadow sat alert, his black and tan coat catching faint slivers of sunlight. His amber eyes tracked every movement around them, the rustling of leaves, the shuffle of boots on snow-covered sidewalks, the hollow bark of a dog several houses away. Shadow was steady, calm, but Michael could feel tension coiled beneath the dog's skin, muscles tightening with something unspoken. That morning, Detective Sarah Miller had called him with an update. Through vehicle registration records, police had identified a black SUV matching Lily's fragmented memory, a late-model Chevrolet Suburban, owned by a couple named Robert and Monica Hale. Married for 10 years, no children registered. Their Elmwood property file showed a renovation permit from last spring, claiming basement soundproofing for a personal recording studio. There was no music business tied to their names, no license filings, no website, nothing. Just a permit. Sarah had warned him again, "Do not go near the house. We'll handle it." But Michael's instincts, sharpened by years of reading danger before it had a name, refused to quiet. He wasn't here to break in. He told himself that. He was just here to look. He pulled the collar of his faded field jacket higher against the cold and crossed the street slowly, Shadow padding silently at his side. From the outside, 1274 Elmwood Drive looked perfect. Almost too perfect. A pale blue two-story colonial with white shutters, a front porch swing, and flower beds lined with decorative stones. A pair of bird feeders hung motionless in the frozen air, untouched by even the boldest winter sparrows. Michael stopped at the edge of the sidewalk, his breath clouding before him. Shadow moved a step closer to the front lawn and sniffed the air, his ears pricking sharply. The German shepherd's posture changed, tail stiff, chest lowered slightly, nostrils flaring against the cold breeze. Then came the sound Michael trusted most, a deep rumbling growl, low in Shadow's throat. Michael's hand tightened instinctively on the leash. "What is it, boy?" he whispered, scanning the house. Shadow took another step forward, head tilted slightly toward the basement windows, where thin frost traced the glass edges. The growl deepened, vibrating under Michael's fingertips like distant thunder. Michael glanced up at the spotless siding, the gleaming shutters, the wreath on the door, arranged with surgical precision. There wasn't a thing out of place, which was exactly what unsettled him. Houses told stories if you knew how to listen, and this one whispered silence too perfect to be honest. He crouched slightly beside Shadow, his gaze following the dog's line of focus. There, near the foundation vent, a faint chemical odor seeped into the cold air, carried on the wind just enough to prick at his senses. Disinfectant. Sharp, industrial, sterile. Shadow's hackles lifted, fur bristling in slow waves across his back. Michael straightened slowly, his jaw tightening beneath days-old stubble. He knew that smell. It wasn't cleaning supplies from a grocery store. It was something designed for erasing. Blood, evidence, traces of what wasn't meant to be found. Across the street, a jogger passed, breath steaming in the cold. She wore a red windbreaker, earbuds tucked beneath her blonde ponytail, and barely glanced at Michael as she moved. Here, people didn't question perfection. Michael tugged Shadow back toward the truck, every muscle taut with restraint. He glanced one last time at the Hale house, noting its symmetry, its silence, the unnatural stillness of curtains pulled too tightly across the windows. Back behind the wheel, he sat unmoving for a long moment. Shadow settled beside him, ears still angled toward the house, as though unwilling to turn away. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the public property permit Sarah had sent earlier. Basement soundproofing, approved 6 months ago. Security upgrades, high-resolution surveillance cameras authorized. Utilities, water usage unusually low compared to neighboring homes. Something wasn't right. Michael drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, his thoughts restless and circling. The image of Lily's battered wrists returned, alongside her whispered memory of the dark basement and the loud SUV. Shadow whined softly beside him, his amber gaze flicking between Michael and the house, as if waiting for a command. Michael reached out, scratching behind the dog's ear, grounding himself in the familiar presence. "Not yet, partner," he murmured. "We're not ready." Instead, he took a slow breath, restarted the engine, and drove past the Hale residence one last time. As he turned the corner, he glanced into the rearview mirror. A pale blue house with white shutters, perfectly still, perfectly quiet. But Shadow's growl still hummed in his memory, low and certain, like a warning carried from somewhere deep beneath the surface. Whatever lived behind those basement walls wasn't music. And Michael was sure of one thing. They were running out of time. The night in Raven Creek was bitter and still, the kind of silence that pressed against the chest and refused to let go. The streets of Elmwood glimmered faintly under the pale wash of the moonlight, each driveway lined with delicate frost, each house glowing softly behind closed curtains. But inside Michael Rourke's mind, the stillness was a lie. He sat behind the wheel of his old Ford, parked 2 blocks away from the Hale residence. The truck's engine was off, but the cold crept in through the glass, frosting faint patterns along the edges of the windshield. Beside him, Shadow sat perfectly still, his large black and tan frame coiled like a spring, amber eyes locked on the quiet street ahead. His ears twitched at distant sounds, nostrils flaring subtly with the sharpness of the winter air. Michael's jaw clenched as he rubbed the back of his neck, the faint stubble scratching against his fingers. He had told himself 100 times that he shouldn't be here. Detective Sarah Miller had made it clear. Stay away until we have the warrant. But patience had never been Michael's gift. Not since Iraq. Not since the firefight that left 3 good men behind because backup arrived 5 minutes too late. Tonight, he couldn't risk waiting. Shadow's ears perked suddenly, his body shifting forward. A soft whine escaped the German shepherd's throat, low and urgent. Then, without hesitation, he turned his head sharply toward the Hale property. Michael frowned. "What is it, boy?" Shadow answered by pawing lightly at the truck door, his amber gaze unwavering, his posture locked on something hidden beyond the perfect facade of the pale blue house. Michael opened the door silently, his boots crunching on the frozen pavement. "Stay close," he whispered. They moved along the sidewalk, keeping to the shadows beneath skeletal maple trees until they reached the edge of the Hale backyard. A tall privacy fence enclosed the property, but at the corner, an older section leaned slightly inward, snow piled along its base. Shadow sniffed once, huffed softly, then pressed forward. Michael followed, easing himself through the gap in the slats until they were inside the Hale property line. The backyard was immaculate. Trimmed hedges, neatly arranged stepping stones, a single bird bath frozen solid under the starlight. And yet, at the far end, something broke the symmetry. A small wooden shed standing against the back fence, its pale gray siding warped and weather-stained, as though time had forgotten this one structure entirely. Shadow froze mid-step, his hackles bristling, a low, guttural growl reverberating from deep within his chest. Michael rested a hand on the dog's shoulder, crouching low, scanning the silent yard. "You smell it, don't you?" he murmured. Shadow's nose pressed into the wind, nostrils twitching. Whatever scent he caught, it had weight. His entire frame stiffened with focus, and when Michael finally gave the silent hand signal, Shadow padded toward the shed without hesitation, his paws soundless on the frosted grass. The shed's door was locked with a rusted padlock, its edges rimed with ice. Michael tugged on the handle once. It held. He looked at Shadow, then back at the small window cracked near the roofline. Pulling his jacket sleeve down, he pressed a hand against the glass and peered inside. What he saw stole the breath from his lungs. Inside, stacked neatly along one wooden shelf, were small bracelets, dozens of them. Some were woven with faded threads, some beaded with tiny charms, others etched crudely with initials or carved names. He stepped back, heart hammering against his ribs, and reached into his pocket, pulling out a compact multi-tool. The old training kicked in, not reckless, just methodical, as he picked the lock carefully until it snapped open with a muted click. The hinges groaned faintly as he eased the door open. The smell hit him first, antiseptic and something metallic beneath it, like a place scrubbed too clean to hide what it once held. Shadow slipped in ahead of him, nose to the floor, weaving through overturned cardboard boxes stacked against the walls. Michael crouched low, careful to avoid disturbing anything. On the far shelf sat a wooden crate, heavier than it looked, the corners dented, one handle splintered. With slow precision, he dragged it into the lamplight filtering through the cracked window and flipped the latch. Inside, rows of bracelets and small photographs filled the box, layered carefully as though they were treasured. Michael picked one up, a tiny purple band, the surface scratched and worn. Etched faintly on the underside was a name, Lily. His throat tightened. He set it aside gently, pulling another photo from the crate. It was a Polaroid, grainy, faded, showing a little girl no older than 7, standing stiffly against a plain white wall, clutching a teddy bear missing one eye. The look in her eyes was hollow. Beneath the photograph, a faint scrawl of ink read, Tessa. Michael's hand trembled slightly as he sifted through more pictures. Boys, girls, different ages, different faces, the same vacant expression in every pair of eyes. This wasn't random. It was organized. Shadow's whimper broke his trance, the dog pressing his nose against the crate, ears flat, body tense. Michael closed the box, locking the latch firmly, and stood slowly, scanning the shed once more before stepping out into the icy air. He crouched beside Shadow, gripping the dog's collar gently, grounding himself. "We've got them, boy," he whispered, voice low but steady. "This is it." Pulling out his phone, Michael stepped away from the shed and dialed Sarah's number. It rang once before her calm, measured voice came through, heavy with the kind of exhaustion that only comes from too many years of seeing the worst. "Miller." "It's Michael," he said quietly, glancing back toward the Hale house. "I found something, a crate, bracelets, Polaroids, dozens of kids." Silence stretched on the line for a beat before Sarah's breath hissed sharply through her teeth. "Do not touch anything else," she ordered, her voice clipped and controlled. "Back away now. I'll call it in and push for an emergency warrant tonight. We'll move on them before morning." Michael hesitated, glancing down at Shadow, who stood rigid, still facing the Hale basement windows even from here. "Sarah," he said finally, his voice quieter, heavier. "This isn't just abuse. It's bigger than that." "I know," she replied, "and we'll take them down. Stay put, Rourke. I'm on my way." Michael ended the call and crouched low beside Shadow, resting his hand gently against the German shepherd's back. His pulse still thundered, but now it carried focus, purpose. They had evidence. The perfect house had cracks, and tonight, for the first time, Michael felt the shadows in Raven Creek shifting. The icy dawn crept slowly over Raven Creek, its pale light painting the quiet streets in washed-out shades of gray. At the edge of Elmwood, the perfect houses stood still under a crust of frost, but the stillness carried weight tonight. Something waited beneath the surface, and for the first time, the shadows were shifting. Inside the Raven Creek Police Department's briefing room, tension hummed like static in the air. Maps of Elmwood were pinned to the board, floor plans projected onto the wall. A dozen heavily armed officers from the SWAT unit stood in black tactical gear, helmets under their arms, rifles resting against their vests. The faint smell of gun oil mixed with brewed coffee, the air thick with anticipation. Detective Sarah Miller stood at the front, shoulders squared, her auburn hair pulled into a tight bun. The harsh fluorescent lights picked out the freckles scattered faintly across her pale skin, but her sharp hazel eyes carried the kind of focus only born from years of walking into rooms where survival wasn't guaranteed. At 42, Sarah had earned her reputation. Decisive under pressure, respected by her team, but beneath the controlled exterior, there was a quiet fire. This case had gotten under her skin. Michael Rourke stood off to the side, hands in the pockets of his worn green field jacket, shadow sitting neatly by his boots. The German Shepherd, 6 years old, was alert but calm, ears pricked, an amber gaze tracking the room as if cataloging every movement. Sarah had initially argued against Michael's involvement. He wasn't law enforcement anymore, but after reviewing the evidence he'd uncovered, she relented. "You stay close," she said, glancing at him briefly. "You and Shadow follow my lead. You get no hero points tonight, Rourke. Understood?" Michael gave a short nod, the weight of old muscle memory settling into his stance. Understood. Sarah turned back to the group. At 0500, we move on 1274 Elmwood Drive. We have confirmation of a basement-level structure beneath the main property. Our primary objective is to secure the location, neutralize threats, and extract potential victims. Robert and Monica Hale are considered dangerous. Robert's known to have military training. We treat him like he knows what he's doing. Nobody goes in alone. The team responded with clipped affirmations, the room buzzing with quiet determination. By the time the convoy reached Elmwood, the neighborhood was wrapped in the fragile hush of pre-dawn. 4 unmarked SUVs slid into position, headlights off, engines idling low. Officers fanned out, forming silent shadows against the manicured lawns. Michael crouched behind the open rear door of the lead vehicle, checking Shadow's harness one last time. The German Shepherd sat poised, ears high, sensing the tension that ran like current through the cold air. Sarah knelt beside the first breach team, her gloved hands tracing the schematic one final time. Beside her stood Sergeant Dean Alvarez, the SWAT team leader, a solidly built man in his mid-40s with deep olive skin, cropped black hair flecked with gray, and sharp brown eyes that missed nothing. A jagged scar ran from his jaw to his neck, earned years earlier during a botched raid in Detroit, and it gave his already commanding presence a harder edge. "Standard entry?" Dean asked, keeping his voice low. "Standard," Sarah confirmed. "Subdue, secure, search." Dean's gaze flicked to Michael briefly, his tone skeptical. "You sure about bringing the civilian?" Sarah didn't flinch. "He found the evidence, and his dog's trained for detection. We need every advantage." Dean grunted, clearly unconvinced but too disciplined to argue further. At precisely 0500, Sarah's soft command crackled through the comms. "Go!" The front team advanced silently, stacking against the pale blue siding of the Hale residence. A breacher stepped forward, set the hydraulic ram against the doorframe, and with one precise motion, crack, the door exploded inward. "Raven Creek PD, search warrant!" Sarah's voice rang out, controlled but sharp. Michael followed at the rear, shadow tight to his leg. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish and lavender, pristine and sterile, like a showroom staged for buyers. The living room was immaculate, every cushion aligned, every picture frame perfectly centered. But as they moved deeper, the silence felt heavier, unnatural. Then came the sound, the faint, hurried scuff of movement below. "Basement!" Sarah signaled, her voice cutting through the comms. The team shifted formation, rifles raised, boots pounding softly against the polished hardwood floor as they reached the door leading down. A narrow staircase descended into shadows, and the air changed immediately. Colder, sharper, tinged faintly with antiseptic. At the base of the stairs, a single hanging bulb swayed gently, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. And there, near a heavy steel door at the far wall, Robert Hale stood, his tall, athletic frame tense and coiled, He was in his mid-40s, dark blonde hair slicked back, sharp cheekbones cutting hard angles across his pale face. His blue-gray eyes flicked between the officers and the small blonde-haired girl he held by the arm. The child couldn't have been more than 7. Her bare feet were scraped and raw, her oversized sweater hanging loosely from her tiny frame. In Robert's other hand, a half-zipped duffel bag sagged heavy with cash, syringes, and medical supplies. "Put the bag down," Sarah ordered, her rifle steady, her voice ice. Robert's lips curled into a tight, humorless smile. "You have no idea what you're walking into," he said, his tone calm, unnervingly composed. Dean stepped forward slightly, his voice clipped. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Robert's grip on the girl tightened, his knuckles whitening. "You don't understand. None of you do." Then he shifted his stance, subtly, but Michael saw it. A lifetime of reading threats sharpened his voice into a single command. "Shadow!" The German Shepherd launched forward, a blur of black and tan muscle and instinct. He hit Robert low, jaws locking around his forearm, wrenching the man sideways. The girl stumbled free, crying out as Dean lunged forward, pulling her into safety. Robert shouted in pain, swinging wildly with his free arm, but Shadow held firm, teeth clamped deep, refusing to let go. 2 SWAT officers moved in fast, tackling Robert to the concrete, wrestling his arms behind his back. "Suspect secured!" Dean barked, snapping cuffs around Robert's wrists. At the far end of the basement, Monica Hale appeared, her auburn hair wild, her pale face streaked with panic. She held nothing in her hands, but the desperation in her hazel eyes screamed resistance. 2 officers intercepted her instantly, forcing her to the ground before she could reach the side door. "Second suspect detained!" Sarah lowered her rifle, exhaling sharply, scanning the room for movement. And then she saw it. A row of locked doors along the far wall. Without hesitation, she signaled one of the officers, who smashed the padlock with the ram. Inside, 3 small girls huddled together on a thin mattress, their wide, terrified eyes blinking under the harsh light. Their faces were pale, streaked with tears and dirt, their breaths shallow but steady. "You're safe now," Sarah said softly, kneeling in the doorway, her voice breaking its sharp edge for the first time that night. "We've got you." Michael stood off to the side, Shadow pressed against his leg, the German Shepherd's chest heaving, warm breath clouding the cold air. He reached down, scratching behind Shadow's ear, grounding himself in the moment. The house above them was silent, but the basement held the weight of secrets now exposed. Robert and Monica Hale were in custody. The children were safe, and Raven Creek would never be the same. Winter sunlight spilled across the small courthouse in downtown Raven Creek, its frosted windows glowing softly against the pale December sky. Inside, the air was heavy with anticipation. Reporters lined the hallway, cameras slung over their shoulders, murmuring into microphones as they waited for the verdict. Parents held onto their children tighter. Volunteers from child advocacy groups gathered silently in the back rows, and the whole town seemed to breathe as one. Michael Rourke sat near the front of the courtroom, Shadow stretched out quietly at his feet. The German Shepherd's black and tan coat gleamed faintly under the filtered light, his ears twitching every time someone shifted behind them. Michael rested a hand lightly on Shadow's head, grounding himself in the familiar warmth of the dog's presence. His green field jacket hung loosely on his shoulders, and his deep-set hazel eyes carried the weight of the last few weeks. Exhaustion, grief, but also quiet resolve. Across the aisle, Detective Sarah Miller stood with her arms crossed, a sharp silhouette against the polished oak railing. Her auburn hair was tied neatly back, and the steady focus in her hazel eyes gave nothing away. At 42, Sarah had spent years facing the darkest parts of humanity, but today was different. Today was about closure, not just for Lily, but for all the unnamed children whose voices had been silenced. At the defense table, Robert Hale sat rigidly, his broad shoulders squared beneath a wrinkled gray suit. His blonde hair was slicked back as though presentation could undo the damage of truth, but his sharp jawline was tense, his pale skin drawn tight with defiance. His cold blue-gray eyes avoided the jury entirely, locked instead on the polished wood of the table before him. Beside him, Monica Hale sat smaller, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders, pale hands folded in her lap. Unlike Robert, her posture had collapsed inward, her hazel eyes swollen from sleepless nights and quiet tears. The trial had lasted 3 weeks, every detail pulling the town deeper into the shadows they hadn't known existed beneath Elmwood's perfect streets. Forensic specialists testified about the evidence recovered from the Hale basement, the soundproofing, the chemical residues, the duffel bag filled with syringes and cash. Witnesses from 3 neighboring counties shared fragments of a larger picture, one pointing to a trafficking network stretching far beyond Raven Creek's borders. And then there was the box from the shed. Michael had been the one to find it. Each bracelet, each Polaroid photo had told the silent stories of children who might never come home. Now, the jury had returned. When the clerk announced the verdict, the courtroom fell silent. On the charges of aggravated child abuse and human trafficking, we find the defendants Robert Hale and Monica Hale guilty on all counts. A wave of sound rippled through the room, gasps, muffled sobs, relief colliding with grief. Robert's jaw tightened, his gaze fixed on the wall as though it could anchor him. Monica lowered her head, silent tears slipping down her cheeks, her pale fingers twisting in her lap. Judge Margaret Hensley, a woman in her late 50s with silver hair pinned neatly and a posture that radiated authority, leaned forward slightly as she delivered the sentencing. Her calm voice carried the weight of the law and the town's collective fury. "For crimes committed against the most vulnerable among us," she said firmly, "Robert and Monica Hale are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without parole." The gavel fell sharply, the sound echoing across the chamber like the closing of a long, bitter chapter. Michael exhaled slowly, his grip on Shadow's collar loosening as the German shepherd pressed closer, sensing the shift in energy. Around them, members of the Raven Creek community wept quietly, some holding hands, others bowing their heads in silent prayer. Later that afternoon, outside the courthouse, Michael and Shadow were met with a small crowd gathered on the courthouse steps. Local residents, volunteers, and even families of rescued children approached them one by one, offering quiet words of gratitude. A young mother hugged Michael tightly, tears glimmering in her blue eyes as she whispered, "You saved more than you know." Sarah stood nearby, hands in the pockets of her charcoal coat, watching Michael with the faintest trace of a smile. "Not bad for a civilian," she said dryly when he finally turned toward her. He smirked faintly, shaking his head. "I didn't do it alone." She glanced down at Shadow, who sat tall and composed despite the crowd pressing around him, his ears alert, his amber eyes steady. "No," Sarah agreed softly. "You didn't." Weeks later, the frost began to thaw, and Raven Creek slowly stitched itself back together. Lily, now wearing clean jeans and a soft pink sweater, sat on the front porch of a modest house on the quieter side of town. She had been officially adopted by George and Marcia Holden, a warm-hearted couple in their early 50s. George, a tall man with thinning brown hair, kind green eyes, and a round, welcoming face, worked as a local carpenter. Marcia, shorter and soft-spoken, had silver-streaked blonde hair, warm blue eyes, and an instinctive gentleness that put children at ease. Together they had always dreamed of a family, and when they met Lily, they opened their hearts without hesitation. Still, Michael visited often, and Shadow always came with him. On the day of their last planned visit before Lily fully settled into her new home, Michael stood on the Holden porch, while Shadow trotted over to where Lily sat cross-legged on the steps, hugging her knees. The German shepherd lowered his head, resting his muzzle gently on her lap. Lily's small fingers tangled in his fur, her soft voice barely louder than the breeze. "You saved me," she whispered, leaning close so only Shadow could hear. "I'll never forget." Shadow pressed closer, his warm breath ruffling the fabric of her sweater, his amber eyes fixed on her face with quiet understanding. Michael stood a few feet away, watching them with an ache in his chest, not of pain, but of something else. For the first time in years, he felt the faint, fragile tug of healing. He had carried ghosts from the desert, scars no one could see, and a heart weighed down by what he couldn't save. But now, watching Lily's small hands clutch Shadow's fur, hearing her whisper into the winter air, something inside him eased. Saving her hadn't just rescued Lily, it had saved a part of himself he thought was lost forever. Sometimes, God doesn't send angels with wings. Sometimes, He sends a soldier with scars, a loyal dog with courage, and a child's quiet whisper beneath a frozen bridge. In Raven Creek, a miracle didn't come with thunder or lightning. It came in the form of hope, fragile, trembling, but alive. Because when one little girl was left in the cold, someone listened, someone cared, someone refused to walk away. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Every single day, we walk past bridges of our own. We pass by people carrying silent battles, broken hearts, hidden pain. We scroll past cries for help, close our doors, and assume someone else will step in. But miracles don't wait. They're made when ordinary people choose to act. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment, Amen, to Stand with Lily. Share this story, because somewhere another child is still waiting under another bridge. Subscribe to join us as we spread stories of love, hope, and second chances. And tonight, may we all pray, Dear Lord, protect the unseen, comfort the broken, and guide us to be your hands in this world. Bless every heart watching this today, and remind us that no child should ever be forgotten. Because sometimes, the smallest act of kindness becomes the biggest miracle someone will ever know.